On the shores of the majestic Dnieper River, one of the bloodiest and most strategically significant operations of the Soviet Army during the Second World War unfolded. The Nikopol Bridgehead became the scene of a fierce struggle between the Soviet troops and the Wehrmacht, where every meter of land was taken at the cost of huge losses. What made the Hitlerite command cling to this small territory despite the obvious hopelessness of the situation? Why did Soviet generals, wasting thousands of lives, storm well-fortified German positions for months? The answer lies in the rare manganese deposits that were the lifeblood of Nazi Germany's tank industry. This is a story about people who fought in the mud and cold, about tactical miscalculations and heroism. The Battle of Nikopol remains one of the least known but one of the most significant pages of military history. When the autumn of 1943 came and the first months of the winter campaign began, the Red Army troops, who concentrated their onslaught on the left bank territory, managed to inflict serious blows on the enemy, forcing the German units to retreat to the eastern bank of the largest Ukrainian river. However, the retreat was incomplete. In the area known as the Nikopol Bridgehead, German troops managed to hold a significant piece of Soviet land. This area was of exceptional importance to both sides. Firstly, there were huge reserves of manganese ore, which was a vital raw material for the production of German tanks and other armored vehicles. Without manganese, it was impossible to temper steel for the armor of combat vehicles and weapons. The Nazi leader issued a categorical order to hold this territory at any cost. When the Minister of Armaments discussed the situation with him, the Fuhrer made it clear that if the manganese deposits were lost, then the war would be lost within 3 months, since the production of the military machine would be completely stopped. The German High Command saw the situation differently. The Chief of the General Staff expressed fears that keeping troops on the left bank was becoming more meaningless every day and threatened a repeat of the tragedy of Stalingrad. However, the dictator's will proved to be unconditional. In addition, the Germans pursued another ambitious goal. The 17th German Army Group was located on the Crimean Peninsula, which fell into conditions close to the blockade. As long as the units remained on the bridgehead, it was theoretically possible not only to hold the peninsula, but even to free the troops encircled there. The combination of economic interests, strategic considerations, and the personal tenacity of the Nazi leader kept German military units in the area, despite the inexorably approaching Soviet offensive. The strip of positions defended by the Germans stretched for 120 kilometers along the front. The depth of this strip was extremely small, only about 35 kilometers in the deepest places. In this limited space, the enemy concentrated an impressive number of military formations: 6 infantry army divisions, 2 armored formations, and 2 mountain rifle divisions, which together amounted to approximately 52,000 combat personnel. They had at their disposal almost 200 tanks and self-propelled artillery installations, including formidable and heavily equipped Ferdinand-type vehicles. All these troops were combined into a single operational group, named after its commander, General Ferdinand Schorner. The Fuhrer did not choose this commander by chance. Schorner had a reputation as a man of courage and determination, possessing serious tactical skills, and convinced of the need for the strictest military discipline. German engineers have built a very strong defense system. The front line consisted of 3 parallel lines of trenches and trenches protected by barbed wire and minefields. Important areas and towns were turned into fortified strongholds capable of long-term defense. For the leadership of the Soviet Union, this foothold was no less important. The German group posed a danger, looming over the Ukrainian direction and posing a threat to the left flank of the Soviet troops, which complicated the plans of the operation to liberate the Crimean Peninsula. In addition, manganese and other mineral deposits were located on the territory of Nikopol and neighboring Krivoy Rog, which were necessary for the restoration and development of Soviet industry. Therefore, getting rid of the German presence in this region as soon as possible became one of the main tasks of the Soviet High Command. The operation to destroy the Bridgehead and liberate the industrial center was entrusted to the troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front under the command of General Fyodor Ivanovich Tolbukin. However, the initial offensive attempts showed that the enemy intended to put up fierce resistance. The Germans organized active counterattacks, effectively using heavy tanks for defense. The Red Army made 5 attempts to seize the Bridgehead and throw the enemy back into the river, but each time the Soviet units suffered losses that were on average twice as high as the Germans. Fierce fighting had been going on all winter in this sector of the front. The most intense fighting unfolded in the area of the hill known as the Nechayev Kurgan. In January 1944, the forces of the 3rd Guards Army under the command of General Lelyushenko and the 5th Shock Army of Commander Tsvetayev made a last attempt to storm enemy positions before preparing a major offensive operation. On January 10, 1944, Soviet units launched an offensive against German fortifications. Despite the involvement of fresh mechanized formations and tank units, the advance was minimal. In 5 days, the Soviet troops managed to advance only 6 kilometers. Adverse weather conditions hindered the development of the operation. The constant rains turned the battlefield into a continuous swamp. On January 17th, the High Command ordered the attacks to cease and preparations for a larger offensive plan to begin. Marshal Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff of the Red Army, pointed out the lack of manpower and military equipment and an acute shortage of artillery ammunition. To the surprise of the Soviet command, the enemy did not think of retreating at all. The Germans turned the Bridgehead into a system of well-prepared engineering defensive lines interconnected by crossfire. The Germans' prolonged retention of the Bridgehead was explained not only by their resilience and combat training, but also by tactical miscalculations of the Soviet command. At the initial stage, a bet was placed on a quick defeat of the enemy, but these plans were repeatedly disrupted. It must be acknowledged that General Fuhrer has demonstrated high military prowess. His tactics were ingenious. The Germans allowed the Soviet infantry to break through, but then launched flanking attacks on tanks lagging behind them, inflicting serious losses on the Soviet troops. The Red Army lost about 60,000 dead, while the Germans lost 3 times as many. Another reason for the failure of the initial offensive was the low combat training and lack of experience of the Soviet units. Most of the combat units consisted of newly conscripted people mobilized in the liberated territories, who also did not have the necessary training. The month-long immobility of the front caused discontent among the top political leadership. Marshal Vasilevsky became convinced that it was impossible to break the enemy's defenses with the current forces, and appealed to the country's top leadership to strengthen the Ukrainian fronts with additional reserves and reinforcements. Vasilevsky at that time was considered one of the most gifted operational commanders of the Red Army. In tense and sometimes heated negotiations with the Stavka, a new plan was being developed. As a result, the following decision was made. It was planned to deliver the main blow to the 3rd Ukrainian Front under the command of Army soldier Rodion Malinovsky. His troops were supposed to deliver a powerful blow in the direction of the Apostolovo railway junction, with 2 army groups and a mechanized corps. This would immediately cut off the entire German grouping on the left bank from the escape routes. Tolbukin's 4th Ukrainian Front was tasked with pinning down German troops with frontal attacks by 3 army formations, preventing them from retreating to the river. To mislead the German command, initially the Soviet troops struck in several places, in the northern section in the direction of Nikopol itself, and in the south in the direction of Krivoy Rog. On January 30, Malinovsky's troops went on the offensive. The commander of the 6th German Army, General Karl Adolf Hulett, believing that he had correctly identified the main directions of the Soviet offensive, threw his tank reserves into battle, including units of the 23rd Armored Division. However, this was part of the Soviet plan. On January 31, after almost an hour of artillery and aviation training, Malinovsky delivered a decisive blow to the German positions in the Apostolovo direction. On the same day, Tolbuchen's troops went on the offensive. By noon on February 1, the Soviet command received a report that the troops had penetrated the German defenses to full tactical depth. An order was given to introduce the 4th Guards Mechanized Corps under the command of General Trofim Tenashishin into the gap.
Realizing the reality of the threat, the commander of the 6th Army hastened to send additional tank divisions there. But at that time, the weather conditions deteriorated sharply. Heavy rains began and the Ukrainian Chernism finally softened. It was extremely difficult for the Soviet infantry to advance. The armored vehicles were literally stuck in the mud, and the gunners had to manually drag the guns forward. Despite all the obstacles, the German positions fell one by one under the blows of the Red Army. The situation in the Apostolovo area became especially critical for the enemy. There was a threat of complete encirclement of the German group on the left bank. Tolbuchen was pushing her from the front, having broken through 11 kilometers to the bridgehead. Realizing the tragedy of the situation, on February 2nd, the Germans began a hasty evacuation of their troops to the right bank along the washed-out roads, where not only trucks, but even heavy tractors sank into the mud. Soviet troops began to pursue the retreating enemy. The assault aircraft attacked the crossings. The hasty retreat significantly changed the balance of power. The German defenses quickly crumbled. The captured officers showed that it seemed completely pointless to continue resisting. On February 5th, as a result of a night attack by the 8th Soviet Army, the Apostolovo railway junction was taken. The 6th German Army was split in two. By February 8th, the enemy held only a narrow strip of coast near the village of Bolshaya Tihaya, which was soon cleared by Soviet troops. Pursued by the Soviet troops, the German units retreated in disorder. Two Soviet frontline groups rapidly entered Nikopol. At the same time, intense fighting began west of the city, as the enemy tried to break free from the pincers of the Soviet encirclement. In an attempt to restore the situation in February, the German 7th Army, which had 2 armored and 3 infantry divisions, launched a powerful counterattack against Malinowski's forces in the direction of Apostolovo. The guards of Chukov's army firmly held their positions despite significant losses and a shortage of ammunition. The fighting shackled the offensive forces, allowing part of the German army to avoid complete encirclement. General Chukov later noted that the enemy suffered incredible losses in these counterattacks, but the Soviet troops also did not concentrate enough forces for a final defeat. Nevertheless, the Germans were unable to stop the Soviet offensive. The remnants of the 6th Army retreated to the Ingulitz River. After the loss of the bridgehead, the High Command transferred part of the Tolbuchinsky troops to the 3rd Ukrainian Front. This allowed Malinowski's formations, despite the most difficult weather conditions and increasing German resistance, to launch an offensive on Krivoy Rog. By February 22, the industrial center was completely liberated. However, the offensive did not continue there. The troops of the 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts suffered huge losses. The divisions were extremely exhausted, requiring replenishment and rest. On February 29, 1944, there was a lull in this sector of the front. The Nikopol operation ended in a complete victory for the Soviet troops. The complete elimination of the bridgehead was achieved, and the territory around Nikopol and Krivoy Rog was taken out of enemy control. The German forces lost the combat potential of 12 divisions. The Wehrmacht suffered losses in the form of approximately 60,000 human lives, 4,000 of which were captured by the Soviets. All German military equipment was either captured or disabled and had to be disposed of.